So I want to turn to a series of points about Rand's thesis about human nature. We're going to, for example, when, in talking about ethics, advocate rational self-interest. It's important to have an understanding of what the self is. And of course, when we start talking about debates in moral philosophy over whether self-interest is an appropriate position, right, or not, in many cases it's not the egoism per se that is the driving force in the debate. It's rather that people have very different conceptions of what a self is, and their different conceptions of human nature are the things that underlie the positions they take when they get to particular issues in ethics. So in the case of Rand, there are four features of the self that are relevant here, and I just want to talk through them fairly briefly. First one is a point that when we're talking about human beings, integration is the operative concept for Rand, that the human being is an integrated entity. Now, when we start analyzing human beings, we notice that they have a body, and they have a mind, right, or various conscious apparatus, right, or they have a physical nature, right, and a psychological nature, right, or they have consciousness and matter. And the point for Rand is that we should understand the human being as an integrated, right, set of capacities, or as a unified, integrated being. And here's a quote in Rand's own words to that effect. Quote, "Man is an indivisible entity, an integrated unit of two attributes, of matter and consciousness, and he may permit no breach between body and mind, between action and thought, between his life and his convictions," unquote. All right, now what this tells us is that Rand's language, that Rand's view of human nature is that she is neither a dualist, right, that dualists being those who see body and mind as two different kinds of things that may or may not work together, may or may not have the same kind of agenda. So rather than any sort of a dualistic account, Rand sees the human being's mind and body as necessarily integrated, and against any form of reductive materialism. Reductive materialists, a certain view of what it is to be scientific and naturalistic in the modern world, find it very difficult to understand consciousness or the psychological side of our natures, and so their theories tend toward dismissing any role for the mind or consciousness, and we see that, for example, in behaviorism. Instead, for Rand, mind is cognitively powerful. It is a real phenomenon. It has causal efficacy, so it can't be dismissed the way realists do. On the other hand, we do need to understand it as dependent upon and fundamentally integrated with the body. There's no possible separation of mind from reality. What this also then means is that when we talk about human beings living in the world, of course, our minds are more theoretical, coming up with abstractions, but for Rand, the important point is always going to be that our theories, thoughts, abstractions, and so forth should be action-oriented, right? They are things that physically we should live on. So we're not going to have any divides between the theoretical, right, and the practical. We need to integrate the theoretical and the practical. We need to integrate what we believe with what we do, and that is just aspects of the more general point that we are a unified, or we should be an integrated mind-body entity. All right, a second point here is that Rand is an advocate of, right, volition, right, or sometimes more colloquially called, right, a position, right, that is free will. So she is not a determinist, right, of any sort. We're not a product of our genes, or we're not just a biological package that just automatically works its way out, say the way a plant does, or the way that most animal species do. We do have the capacity to make choices, to be moral agents responsible for the choices and the actions, right, that we engage in. Neither are we products of the environment. We're just lumps of plasticine molded and shaped by our environmental forces. And so that when we grow up, we can't be held responsible for how we were raised, and so it comes with what we do. Nor are we puppets in the hands of a god, any sort of divine omnipotence that typically argues that human beings are merely puppets in the hands of divine forces and so forth. Instead, Rand argues that, and it is our rational capacity for her, that we have this capacity to focus our minds or not focus our minds, and then depending on whether we choose to keep our minds in focus, and to follow through on on the things that our mind is focusing on with our bodies, with our physical capacities. That is a real capacity. It's not any sort of breach of cause and effect. Instead, given the psychological and physical nature of human beings in Rand's view, a new kind of causal capacity has come into existence, a self-regulatory, abstract capacity that we call human reason. That there are many types of cause and effect relations in the world. When life comes into existence, life is not necessarily just reducible to underlying chemicals. We start to talk about biological cause and effect. When conscious beings come into existence, evolutionary speaking, new forms of causal powers come into existence. When conceptual psychological beings like ourselves come into existence, other forms of causality come into existence rather, and volition, the capacity of cognitive self-regulation is one good way of putting it, or that is to say the ability to control our rational capacity, to focus on this or that, to take a given datum in our mind and to act on it. That is a legitimate causal factor. All right, the third point. All right, a third point has to do with Rand's view of the relationship between reason and emotion. For Rand, both our rational capacity and our emotional capacity are enormously important to us. The objectivity point and the importance of reason we have already talked about. But when we start to get to her ethical theories, her political theories, and her aesthetic theories, the importance of the pursuit of happiness, right, and being able to live a life that we enjoy, to do the things in our life that give us deep and immense satisfaction, all of these are important points of it. And certainly in the Romanticism, that exaltation, right, that exalted sense of human potential, and to feel it as much as possible, right, in one's own life is an important part of her overall philosophy. So that we have a very rich and powerful emotional capacity is of crucial importance to Rand's theory as well. Now, in the history of philosophy, of course, there's an ongoing debate about whether reason and emotion are connected to each other, or if they're disconnected, whether they're enemies of each other and in conflict with each other, if there is tension between the two capacities, which should have priority. Should we give credence more to reason if it conflicts with emotion, or should we subject our reason to constraints and let our emotions rip, so to speak, if there's a conflict and so forth. Now, as part of Rand's general point, Rand wants to argue that reason and emotion can and should be harmoniously integrated faculties, right? That we're not born in any dualistic fashion with two sides to our nature, the emotional side and the rational side, and that they have different agendas and conflict with each other. They are and can be integrated with each other, and that in her judgment, it is reason that is in the driver's seat in initially programming our emotions. So we have an emotional capacity, but the emotional capacity does not have a life of its own. What we come to have particularized feelings for, right? We have affection for this person, right? Or we have anger toward this person, or we have fear of this dog, right, and so forth. All of those emotions, right, are programmed by the thoughts and value judgments that our reason, right, comes up with. So reason, she argues, in the long term is the driver of emotions. Of course, what can happen is that you can have certain experiences and reach certain conclusions at one point in your life and come characteristically to have certain kinds of emotions. And then later in life, you have different kinds of experiences and you come to reach different kinds of judgments. So it is possible to have conflicts between what's going on in your reason at any given time and what's going on in your emotions, right, at any given time. On Rand's analysis of how this works, though, what is really going on is a conflict between experiences and judgments that one reached earlier in one's life with experiences and judgments that one is reaching now in one's life. Now, when that happened, Rand argues that since reason is the thing that has the most direct connection to reality, right? It's the thing that we can inspect directly, we can verify its conclusions, we can do the experiments and so forth. If we're deciding what we should think and what we should do, reason should, so to speak, be our legislator and primary executive function. So if there's a conflict between one's reason and one's emotion, reason should be the driver, and instead what one should strive to do, and in extreme cases perhaps therapy is important, is necessary, but it's possible for people to change their emotions if their emotions are out of tune with what their rational judgment suggests. Striving for an integration between reason and emotion and getting those two to work harmoniously are important features of Rand's philosophy. And a fourth point that I want to mention here is a human nature point, but it's a quasi-moral point. It's a bridge point, but it's important given the history of philosophy here. Rand is an advocate of moral tabula rasa. Tabula rasa is a thesis that's sometimes used with respect to the cognitive capacities that we have, but it also is used in discussing the moral nature of human beings. So to speak, what is the moral package that we are born with? Sometimes the issue is put, are we born good, are we born bad, or are we born neutral? And for Rand, she is very much an advocate of the view that we are born morally, right, tabula rasa. We're not born with any particular beliefs. We're not born with any habits of action. We're not born with an emotional preset. Instead, we acquire all of these things. What we're born with is a rational capacity, emotional capacity, a capacity to form certain actions habitually, and of course, always because of free will, to act in a particular way, to change our habits if we so to speak. And so it's not that we are born, right, preset right, one way, right, or another. Instead, we are responsible for the beliefs that we come to acquire, the actions that we require to do, because we started from a neutral standpoint. Quote, "Man is a being of self-made soul," unquote. So in this case here, Rand is a strong opponent, right, of any sort of very pessimistic thesis about human nature, such as we see in Plato's myth of Gyges, or in the Hebrew scriptures and its doctrine, right, of original sin. Both of them argue that human beings are born with certain capacities that are both self-destructive and other-destructive, and it's almost impossible or very difficult for human beings to control themselves. Rand disagrees entirely, right, with that assessment. We're not born preset with any instincts that are destructive, or any thoughts that are destructive, or habits of action and so forth that are destructive. Also, she disagrees with the other side of the equation that argues that human beings are born kind of with automatic goodness in them, and so to speak, just left to its own devices, a baby will grow up to have good thoughts, good actions, right, and so forth. For Rand, thoughts and actions are things that we have to choose to acquire and choose to act upon, and they are all acquired from a tabula rasa basis. Quote, "No one is born with any kind of talent, and therefore every skill has to be acquired. Writers are made, not born. To be exact, writers are self-made," unquote. Now, all of this put together feeds into Rand's advocacy of ethical egoism, or what are, broadly speaking, our approach to moral philosophy, right, should be. A certain understanding epistemologically about the central importance of the human rational capacity, a certain understanding of what human capacities are, the relationship between mind and body, whether we are in control of our thoughts and actions or not, the relationship between important capacities like reason and emotion, whether we're born with the dice loaded against us, right, or loaded in favor of us, and so forth. All of these things shape then our understanding of what's possible to us. So then when we turn to what is good for us and what we should do, ethics proceeds then on this epistemological and human nature basis.